creo que es interesante aprovechar que entre el público tenemos gente que venís de la recuperación de materiales. Tenemos un poco los rotor de Barcelona por aquí, tenemos a gente que venís de la academia, que venís incluso de administraciones públicas, así que creo que sería interesante poder escuchar vuestras preguntas y opiniones sobre lo que nos han contado. Sí, Alejandro, Jean, you can come, and Daniel, maybe you can also come. Y yo tengo preguntas, pero creo que es mejor escuchar las vuestras antes de saltar a las mías.
Thank you all. I'm Federico from Research and Degrowth here in Barcelona, and I wanted to ask, because I think like all these presentations didn't touch so much the topic of conflict and struggle, class struggle, and how would architects as a profession deal with it, given that, as you were mentioning, concepts like accumulation by dispossession, and we know that when capital meets limits to growth, it tends to dispossess and backlash. And so architects, if they want to facilitate limits to growth by design, they might go against the interest of capital. And so is there any do you think that discussion about conflict should be part of architecture and planning discussion? And what should we say about it?
Certainly. I think this is an unavoidable question, and also it's quite relevant because I think in the planning field, we direct a lot of our energy and attention to how we deal with conflict. And of course, the conflict in the degrowth context would be different from other types of conflicts that we are dealing with every day. And I think in the planning field, it's really hard to deal with this. If we resort to planning theories, for example, the most updated one on agonistic planning will really address conflicts, not just get consensus. Then I think it gives a foundation to highlight that conflict is important, but it does not really equip planners with concrete methods to deal with these conflicts. So I think also what I think is maybe 2 points. First, I think it's quite necessary to talk about normativity in planning because if we want to promote degrowth, that means we already take a moral and ethical position. And so in that sense, we can't be just focusing on getting consensus and compromises. So then that means we actually need to fight for certain values. And so in that sense, it's quite important to address the ethical premises of planning, which I think is quite missing in the current planning field. And also another thing, I think I reflect more about this capitalist system, because that's what I say, that planning very often is quite constrained by the larger societal structures, because we are living in a capitalist market economic dominant society. And I think planning alone cannot certainly achieve the ideal degrowth future. So I think the political dimension really also need to be challenged.
Yeah, just a few quick things. I mean, on the one hand, I think about groups like ACAN, the Architects Climate Action Network. I don't know if there's a kind of office of it here, right? I mean, it's a kind of distributed group. There's certainly one in the Netherlands. It started in the UK, Australia, parts of the US. Architects Lobby is another group that's been sort of agitating for reimagining, installing different sorts of labor relations within architecture. So on the one hand, there's the kind of activist dimension, right, which doesn't quite answer the question, but sort of suggests that it's under discussion. And the other way I would respond is sort of pedagogically in teaching. I think a lot of what we're trying to do in architecture schools today is to train architects to be decarbonizers, right? So the project is not necessarily to make a building, but to decarbonize the built environment. And I mean, that already causes a bunch of uproar in various discussions. But it's a difficult line, right? Because very easily, as we've seen, as Alejandro helped us to see very clearly, we're so overwhelmed by permission structures, right? That sustainability means we can put all these trees on the building and it's, on the cover of every possible sustainable architecture book in the world. But it's really just a permission structure to keep doing more or less the same thing. I mean, and we could get into the nuance of what more or less means there, right? Which is to say, if we start to think about architects as decarbonizers or a sort of degrowth approach in the field, are we just adding another permission structure, such that even our solutions are carbon intensive, right? And so ultimately, I think there's a question around just sort of political agitation more generally relative to growth and climate and equity and distribution, that architects as citizens can certainly be a part of. I'm not sure that there's something specific to the architectural practice that activates that political dimension most effectively, right? But it's certainly something worth considering.
I also have I don't know if the word is nuance or divided answer, because if the question is if architects, how architects can address conflict, well, it's a tough question, because in a very practical way, architects, they respond to clients. I often think of architects and carpenters. We deliver some products and services, and that's the nature of the relationship between architects and buildings. They usually receive commissions. Public institutions have different agendas than private. But so to say, you cannot have a conflict with the client in a black and white or everything or nothing way. Like that is the relationship that defines you. And that's why, obviously there is always conflicts between clients and architects. So there might be, I would say, yes, there can be conflicts, but they have to be done in a way that they maintain the dynamic of the profession. That's why, so to say, I prefer the description of narratives. What I think is that architects need to try to insert or establish or propose or extend a narrative in which either degrowth or sufficiency or carbon, I don't know if it's extraction or reduction, those things are part of the narrative that the client wants to have. I know that sounds a bit like mainstream economics, like we can work the system. I don't know exactly if that can work incrementally, but I think very often on terms of persuasion. There should be, in my view, there should be a way by which when explaining the social values of collective land use should be appealing, so that someone says, I want that. Because if you cannot deliver that, then it's hard to know how it's going to be a tough conflict. It's basically me against you. So there has to be a work of persuasion where buildings are shown, look, with this building, there is less CO2 in the atmosphere. That would be for a client something persuasive. So I see conflict in a minor way, but not on the major clash.
So just to place that in one maybe complicated example, I think a lot about when the computer took over firms, right? Or continues, is still in the process of kind of organizing the way we operate as professionals. And, I think directly, it's persuasion. It's sort of imagining those client environments when you're trying to explain what's possible by virtue of this screen that's doing funny things, or, that it is not necessarily the native language or the familiar terms that a client is expecting, right? But that you're introducing a different sort of cultural dimension to the discussion, right? Of course, the computer also meant more profit, whereas sometimes we're talking about less profit. So there's a lot of other things going on, right? But it's that, it's just to say that the practice has transformed dramatically before and continuously, right? So it's not like architecture is some stuck thing that we can't kind of shake up. Yeah.
¿Alguna otra pregunta o comentario?
Hello, my name is Luisa. I'm from Brazil, and it's a discussion that I think is not super present in Brazil or like other third world countries. And I think it's because we're still dealing with things like trying to give basic infrastructure for like a big part of our population. So because of that, I think during my university, for instance, we almost never talk about this kind of discussion. And for sure, this is a problem because I don't think the world can wait for us to arrive in this place of like, okay, now we're able to start discussing that. But at the same time, I don't know how we can bring this discussion while continue to understand we have urgent issues that are super important, that we cannot start like talking about material while our people that are like don't have a place to live or don't have the minimal infrastructure. So I don't know how to if a question.
I think I find that Barcelona is one of the cities where the two sides of this discourse, which I would put into environmental justice and degrowth, touch hand in hand. Maybe there are other cities where that happens, maybe Paris and so on, but I think here there is a critical mass of colleagues working on those both sides, and I think both sides are very much connected. So I think that my impression is that it's precisely the overuse of resources for regions and contexts, call them X, doesn't need to be Brazil, but to regions where they really need fast development to increase, let's say, life expectancy, without knowing exactly what they need, meaning each place might know what they need. But basically, it's our resource overexploitation, which requires us to free up our resources for someone else to use, whether that is Brazil, because it's needed. I don't know if it's road infrastructure or large infrastructure, etc. That I don't know, and that will be something that maybe you can bring light. But I think that both things are very connected. So I am not sure. The question of leapfrogging, whether Brazil can make it into degrowth already before going through a phase of high industrial development and so on, that is a good question. I have no idea. But I don't think that is an important, so to say, question for us here, because that would really depend on the context and what is highly used. And maybe I'm responding to the globalization or universalization of the discourse.
Yeah, I published a paper in 2010, and the title of the paper is Degrowth Relevant to China, because I'm originally from China. And that at that time, when I talk about this topic to Chinese, they were just laughing. What are you talking about here? Because they think, of course, China is at that time still have a relatively lower living standards compared to the Western countries. So I think for them it's not legitimate to talk about this. And I think I fully understand. But I think first the degrowth is mainly for the rich countries. It's a kind of moral responsibility that rich countries need to take. And I think that's quite relevant to environmental justice, but also climate justice. This justice dimension when it comes to reduction in climate change emissions, gas emissions. So that's the first thing. But I think still for countries which are not developed yet or not rich enough, it's also to think about not using the Western countries as a role model, following the same trajectory or growth trajectory, but actually think about other development alternatives. And I think in the past degrowth conferences, this North and South perspective, this colonial, neo-colonial perspective has been much more addressed. So So it's also about to break this linkage, this dependency of the southern countries on the north. So therefore, I think that's the perspective that perhaps we need to take, but not just to tell those people living in those countries to reduce their consumption.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say quickly, I think in relative to the sort of comfort equation, right? I mean, this is a very palpable sort of life and death question often, right? And I think very much talking about, how to reduce excess in those economies that are over conditioning their environments and sort of locking that in, does not suggest that in other parts of the world, I mean, this terrifying dynamic, I mean, I think of colleagues I'm working with in Karachi, where the heat is getting so intense, not only in a wave condition, but in a constant condition, right? Where even air conditioners aren't really doing the job anymore, right? So it's a question of new technologies that will allow for collective cooling facilities once the air conditioners fail, right? And so the kind of energy and climate dimensions are already sort of disastrous. But it's precisely as was just noted, right? That the kind of northern economies, over carbonized economies, as I like to think of them, right, have the capacity to reduce excess, so that, I mean, almost in the sense of a kind of equitable transfer of comfort or of energy to other parts of the world. But I think just one other caution, around this question of urgency, and it's quite delicate, and of course, again, we're talking about in the big picture sort of people's lives and well-being, right? And I don't take it lightly, but I think the discourse a lot of times in the climate discussion that how do we act, or how do we justify urgent action when, well, back to Walter Benjamin, that any state of emergency is just kind of a opening up for authoritarian politics, right? And I mean, we see that every day, frankly. Good reasons to not kind of focus on the urgency question, but at the same time, when we don't kind of recognize the urgency of carbon reduction, of climate transformation, again, taking future people into account, right, complicates the analysis of those lives that are helped or saved in these questions. And, that's a very difficult position to be in, but I think it's one that we're all in, right, in terms of thinking about the present and those in need, and thinking about the future and those who will be in need, and et cetera.
Hola. Jo vull fer una pregunta com a arquitecte que es comença a sentir molt encuriosit i alhora molt espantat per l'arribada de les IAs. Llavors... Begin again? Or...
Do you mind? Yeah.
Yeah. M'agradaria fer una pregunta com a arquitecte que se sent molt encuriosit i alhora espantat per l'arribada de les IAs. Llavors, volia saber si creieu que poden ajudar a traslladar el decreixement de la teoria a la pràctica, o és un debat que no té cap mena de sentit?
Sí, so good.
I didn't get one word.
Inteligencia artificial.
Obligatory. Pensaba que después de aprender varios idiomas, digo, bueno, esto yo lo entenderé. Había un par de palabras que no entendía. ¿Por qué tengo yo? Why do I have this? That's a good one. I would say something. And again, this might sound like this is mainstream economics. Little by little, we'll figure it out. But the truth is that I don't think efficiency and sufficiency are dialectical parts. So I think that the photovoltaic panel and the triple glass window can exist in the same universe where one doesn't heat the room and tries to live in a more simple manner. So I would say I wouldn't exclude it. I think there might be ways in which I don't know exactly how will it apply, if it will apply to construction or to kind of domotics and the regulation of areas. But I would not say that needs to be excluded, because otherwise, and this might be debatable, I understand, but I don't think that technology is out of the equation. High technology is just the ratio, or how are they incorporated? So to say, I will keep using trains, and they're industrial, but they're also positive to not use planes and so on. So I would say I don't think they need to be excluded. I have the impression that you have a thesis, that you have an opinion. So I don't know if you want to share your opinion.
The question, sorry, it's very strange when I talk with this. Your question is about AI, right? Yeah. I think that's a very good question because I have never thought about this and I didn't say research on that. But I think generally I think this AI technology is a democratic problem. Because those technologies really defines and shapes the society, including the planning and architecture, without involving the larger society. So they have too much power, monopoly, those technology companies. So we are becoming quite passive in this sense. So first, I think this is not in line with degrowth at all, those development of big technologies. That has this defining power of how the society would look like. Second, I think if we consider AI as a kind of new technology, and then in the planning field, we're dealing with new technologies every day, technological innovation. For example, the twin light, I don't know if you know this kind of program that simulate the kind of city development, the current city status. And that has also been, this is just an example, which I think I just want to point to that new technologies come and go. And I would consider AI as one type of this technology. And then we should shape this technology in a direction that we want, and not just leave this technology to lead us somewhere in the future. So I don't have a good answer to you, but I think if we want to use AI to be a driving force of degrowth, we certainly can find potentials. But the problem, perhaps the challenge, perhaps, is that we don't have a goal of a kind of society goal about how we want to utilize AI in planning that can actually fulfill this society goal.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and really appreciating Alejandro's analyses of the kind of what happens when you peel back the planted facade of some of these sustainable buildings and understand the structural costs. I think you would have a similar analysis of the example I'm about to briefly give. But firms that are establishing themselves similar to Rotor in Brussels, there's a group in Australia called Second Edition, which is about reuse of materials, right? And reuse of everything from toilets to pieces of marble to bags of cement to sort of construction sites, mining. And what they've done is tried to set up a warehouse that's tagged and an AI system that can basically help the architect understand how they can build the project with these available secondhand materials, right? So an intervention of basically a complex, a lot of computation, right, as a means to produce a building out of waste. Yeah, so that seems promising. And I'm sorry to ventriloquize you, right? But of course the first analysis is, okay, what's the carbon cost of the AI, right? And did that overwhelm the cost of the new building materials, right? And we see the massive expansion of the ongoing increase of carbon energy resources. AI is a big piece of that. The cooling line that used to be the cooling increase was the biggest anticipated demand, and server farms have now overtaken it, right? So I think we have to take that incredibly seriously, that there's a huge environmental cost to these systems. But reflecting a bit what Jen just said, there was a fabulous article, I think about 1987, by Lawrence Weiner, kind of one of the initiators of a kind of science and technology studies approach to scholarship. The question was, do artifacts have politics, right? Is there something inherent in a technological system or object that makes it more democratic or more authoritarian? And he was comparing solar panels and nuclear power, right? And the conclusion was that kind of basically no, there's nothing inherent in the materials or the system that make them democratic or authoritarian. But if you look at those two, solar panels allow for a different kind of distributed knowledge, a different kind of distributed energy generation, a certain amount of independence or interdependence amongst communities. Democratic values follow on, right? Whereas nuclear power, completely centralized, one person presses the button, all of the energy sort of goes to one place. If there's a mishap or if somebody decides to control it, there's nothing you can do, right? You have no access then. So, not quite authoritarian, but certainly not quite democratic. And so I think we have to think again about, the realms of AI and the sort of tech overlords that accompany the technology, right? And try to understand what we're buying into, again, at the energy level and at the sort of broader socio-political level as we're playing out these possibilities. Yeah.
Maybe I can supplement with a very concrete example where we use technology actually to open up some understandings of futures. We have a kind of a VR lab in our university as a kind of infrastructure, the virtual reality, where you can actually project what will happen in the future. And so with this 3D, 3D, this glasses, you can actually have a kind of a virtual experience of what the future will look like. So we utilize that to engage participants when, for example, when we build a neighborhood or in a community, to show if we make this kind of decision choices, what will happen in the future. If we don't deal with this and that, how the climate will change and what kind of climate disasters we will have and what impacts we have. So this gave a very big impacts on those participants when they use this technology to realize that the disasters, for example, if we follow the current trend. So I think maybe that's one of so you can utilize that to open your horizons, to maybe grasp a little bit better about the future consequences. And so it could be a tool for political debates and more participation and so on. So I think maybe we can also use AI in this, and also that ways that could help to also make people being more aware of those different future choices.
Thank you, the three of you. We are almost there on time, and I think we need to leave it because not only people have lives outside of this room, but also the translators also need to finish on time because of the amazing work they're doing. But we can stay some minutes here to discuss on person, the people who wants. I'm going to switch to Catalan now. Només per donar-vos les gràcies per venir, per recordar-vos que, primer de tot, això s'està gravant, us ho enviarem quan estigui publicat i en farem difusió i agrairem que en feu difusió qui cregueu que li pot ser interessant. També, que com deia al principi, això forma part d'una recerca de 3-4 anys que estem fent sobre aquest tema. Per tant, si voleu parlar d'això amb el que sigui, doncs teniu el nostre contacte per parlar-ne. I també perquè l'any que ve la nostra idea és fer una altra sessió com aquesta. Per tant, si teniu noms o idees de gent que voleu convidar, doncs tenim la sort de tenir recursos per poder portar gent de fora, portar tots aquests mitjans. Així que, if you have names that you want to suggest as well, sisplau, feu-nos-ho. I era la gràcia d'aquesta activitat d'avui, que és molt carbointensiva, portar 3 persones de fora, però era intentar aprofitar al màxim dels contactes que puguem fer d'estar aquí presencialment, dels contactes que puguem fer aquí els que estem, i traguem-ne màxim profit, no? Doncs moltes gràcies per venir.